The story we tell about the Tauren is a beautiful one, but it is not entirely true. We speak of them as the gentlest people of Azeroth, great in stature, soft in temperament, a race that never raised a hand. It did not have to raise, walking their grasslands in quiet harmony with a world that seemed to love them back. It is the picture the plains themselves invite, the tall grass bending in the wind, the herds moving unhurried beneath an open sky, the totems rising above Thunder Bluff like patient old friends. Harmony, we call it. Balance. And we assume, as we always assume of gentle things, that such peace must have come easily. It did not. The harmony of the Tauren was not a gift of a kind world. It was carved over untold centuries, out of a world that tried again and again to erase them. Their serenity is not the absence of struggle. It is what remained after the struggle nearly took everything. And that leaves a question I have carried across more roads than I can count. A civilization that never sought to master the land, that never bent the world to its will, or built its greatness upon conquest. How does such a people endure at all? Can a civilization remain strong without conquering nature? Or is gentleness, in the end, only a slower way of vanishing? I am Keeper Aldrich, and I have spent a long life gathering the histories that others let slip into the dust. I have knelt among broken stones and listened to survivors whose grandparents remembered the wars in question. What I offer you now is not the Tauren as they appear on a tapestry. It is the Tauren as the record reveals them, a people who answered that question not with a philosophy, but with their survival. To understand them, one must begin before the wandering, before the wars, in the oldest myth they carry. The Tauren call themselves the Shu Halo, the children of the earth, and their chronicles say they were not built or bred, but grown, that the Earth Mother spread her hands across the plains of the dawn, and wherever the shadow of her arms fell, the first of their kind rose up out of the soil like the grain rises. In their telling, the sun and the moon are her two eyes, Anshe and Musha, the one shining so the way would be clear, the other guiding the tides and the winds so her children could always hear her voice. This is not, to them, poetry. It is lineage. When a Tauren speaks of the land as kin, he means it in the plainest sense a word can carry. The rivers, the stones, the beasts, the grass beneath the hoof, all of it is the body of the same mother from whom they themselves were drawn. From that single belief, everything else in their culture follows with a kind of iron logic. If the land is your mother, you do not strip it for profit. You take only what you need to live and no more, and you treat the taking of more as a wound against the one who made you. By their own reckoning, the Tauren regarded mining and logging for gain and the needless killing of the land's creatures, not as crimes against law, but as desecration. Where other peoples asked how much they could wrest from the world, the Tauren asked only how little they could disturb it. This is the foundation stone of everything that follows, and it is worth holding on to, because it is precisely this refusal, this decision never to conquer, that the world would spend the next several ages punishing them for. The oldest of their myths carries a darker turn still, one that shapes how the Tauren understand violence itself. In the beginning, the chronicles say, the Earth Mother's twin eyes taught the young Shu Halo everything they knew, how to work the elements, to build and to sing, to hunt and to ferry the rivers. But while her children were still new to the world and unable to defend themselves, the old ones stirred in the deep places, and stretched their whispers across the land, corrupting many of the Tauren, teaching them of war and hatred, turning them against one another. When the Earth Mother woke to see what had been done, she understood that she too could be reached by that corruption, that she was no longer a safe haven for the ones she loved. And so, from what the records preserve, she gave herself up to keep the shadow from taking the rest. Anshe was wounded in that ancient grief, and the Tauren speak of a son that still carries its hurt, kept alive only by the light of his sister the moon, who chases him across the sky without end. It is worth sitting with what this myth claims. In the Tauren's own account of themselves, war and hatred were never native to their nature. They were an infection carried in from outside, a thing done to them before they were strong enough to refuse it. Everything the Tauren became afterward can be read as the long labor of a people trying to return to who they were before the whispers first reached them. For the deepest truth of Tauren history is that their gentleness made them prey. The wandering did not begin by choice. Long before any orc set foot on Kalimdor, the Tauren held ancestral lands of their own, and they lost them. The chronicles preserve the reason in a tale the Tauren themselves call the hatred of the Centaur, and it deserves telling with care, because its roots reach into a grief that touched even the demigods. The Centaur were born of a union that should never have been. Zhaitar was a keeper of the grove, the firstborn son of the great forest lord Cenarius, a being of nature's own nobility. He came into the deep places of central Kalimdor, and there met Theradras, a princess of the earth elementals, and rather than bind or banish her as he had intended, he fell in love with her. From that forbidden joining, the Centaur were born, and their first act upon entering the world was to murder their own father. Theradras, grieving, entombed Zhaitar's spirit in her lair, a place the Centaur named Maraudon, and would forever treat as holy ground. Then the creatures multiplied and spread, and they fell upon the Tauren. What followed was not a war in the way we usually mean the word. It was an unmaking. The Centaur drove the Tauren from their ancestral holdings, land so scoured by the conflict that the Tauren would come to call it Desolace, the desolate place. And here the record shows us something remarkable, something that shapes everything after. The Tauren did not answer extermination with extermination. They fought when they were struck, and the accounts say they made the Centaur pay dearly for every unprovoked raid. But they had no love for war. When the horsemen came, the Tauren would as often gather their tents and their herds and simply leave, choosing to find a new home rather than throw their lives away holding an old one. A year of peace, the chronicles say, was always followed by a year of war, and so they lived, not as conquerors, not even as defenders of a fixed land, but as a people in permanent motion, hunting the great Kodo across the plains of the barrens, raising tent settlements that shifted with the seasons and the weather, and seeking always the wisdom of the Earth Mother in the one thing the Centaur could never take from them, their memory of who they were. There was a strange grandeur to that wandering life, for all its hardship. The Tauren followed the great Kodo herds across the savanna, and the hunt was less a slaughter than a covenant. They took the mighty beasts for hide and meat and bone, and honored what they took, wasting nothing, because to waste was to insult the mother who had provided. Their settlements were not cities, but gatherings of tents that rose and fell with the seasons, moving as the grass moved, as the weather turned, as the herds led them. A people like that leaves little behind. They raise no monuments, carve no lasting roads, and lay their dead beneath the open sky rather than in halls of stone. And so their whole history had to be carried rather than built, held in song, in the telling of elders, in the totems each family bore from one camp to the next. From what the records suggest, this is why memory became sacred to the Tauren in a way it is to few other peoples of Azeroth. When you own no permanent place, the only ground you truly stand on is the ground of what you remember. The cost of that wandering is easy to underestimate. To wander is not romantic when it is forced. It means a people who never bury their dead in the same ground twice. It means numbers that stay small, because the wandering life cannot feed multitudes, and small numbers mean that every raid, every hard winter, every lost herd brings the whole race a step nearer to vanishing. For generations upon generations, the Tauren existed at the thin edge of survival, and they existed there precisely because they would not become the thing that hunted them. They could have chosen the Centaur's road, to take land by slaughter, to hold it by terror. The likeliest reading of their history is that they understood the option perfectly well and refused it, not out of weakness, but out of a conviction that a people who conquered the land would no longer be the children of the Earth Mother at all. They would have survived as something else. They chose to remain themselves, even at the price of nearly not surviving as anything. This is the first turn in the story, and it changes the meaning of that gentle picture we began with. The serenity of the Tauren was never innocence. It was a discipline held under centuries of pressure that would have broken a harder people into cruelty. And for the longest stretch of their history, that discipline earned them nothing but the open road and the constant nearness of the end. Then, into that endless wandering, came a people who understood exile as well as the Tauren did. When Thrall led the orcs across the sea to Cairne, they were themselves a race trying to remember what they had been before chains and demon blood had remade them. The meeting, when it came, was almost accidental. The accounts describe Thrall coming upon Tauren beset by the very centaur that had hunted them for ages, and the young war chief chose to help. The Tauren he aided were the people of Cairne Bloodhoof, chieftain of the Bloodhoof tribe, an aging warrior of enormous strength and, more importantly, enormous wisdom. In the orcs, Cairne saw something he had perhaps stopped expecting to find: strangers with power and honor both, who used their strength on behalf of a people not their own. What passed between them was not a mere alliance of convenience, though it served both. It was a recognition. Here were two exiled peoples, each carrying the ghost of a homeland, each trying to hold on to honor in a world that rewarded only force. Cairne repaid the orcs by standing with them. The records show him aiding Thrall in the founding of Durotar and later joining the campaign that broke Dalen Proudmoore's invasion in the marshes of Dustwallow. But the debt ran both ways, and the greater gift the orcs gave the Tauren was not a battle won. It was the thing the Tauren had lacked for hundreds of years. It was a home. With Thrall's escort, Cairne led his people into a wide green vale ringed by cliffs, and there they came upon a cluster of high mesas rising sheer out of the grass. The place is called Mulgore, and the mesas would become Thunder Bluff. What they chose to build there is telling. A people who had been driven from land after land did not, upon finally securing a land of their own, carve it open or wall it off, or raise a fortress to dominate the plain. They built upward, setting their city atop the windswept bluffs, lifted above the grasslands on the natural stone. It is fair to read something deliberate in that, a people treading as lightly on the vale below as any of their size could manage. Thunder Bluff was made a refuge where a Tauren of every tribe was welcome, and one by one the scattered tribes, who had wandered apart for so long that unity itself had nearly been forgotten, came in from the plains and gathered under Cairne's rule. I have stood on those bluffs myself in my travels and felt the wind come across the mesa the way it must have come across it that first day. It carries the smell of the grass a long way up. It is very quiet, and it is difficult, standing there, not to feel the weight of what that quiet cost to earn. For the first time in hundreds of years, the Tauren had a land to call their own, and they had won it not by conquest of nature, but by alliance. They did not defeat the world. They found at last a corner of it that would hold them, and friends willing to help them hold it. This is the second great turn in the story, and it recasts the wandering behind it. All those centuries of refusing to take land by force had not been a slow surrender. They had been the Tauren keeping themselves intact, keeping their gentleness whole, until the moment came when gentleness could finally put down roots. The harmony we imagined at the beginning is real, but it did not descend upon them like sunlight. They carried it unbroken through the dark, and only here on the mesas of Mulgore were they at last able to set it down. Unification itself was no small marvel, and the record does not let us take it for granted. These were tribes that had drifted apart across centuries of wandering, each with its own totems, its own elders, its own long grievances, held together by little more than a shared mother faith and a shared memory of loss. That they came together at all under a single banner speaks to how deeply they hungered for a home, and to the particular gravity of the one who called them. Cairne ruled not as a conqueror of his own people, but as their patient center, welcoming every tribe, settling their disputes by counsel rather than command, bearing the ancient Bloodhoof rune spear less as a weapon than as a sign that the oldest line still held. In time, the Tauren would even find their own road to the light, praying not to a borrowed foreign power, but to An-Shea, the sun that had watched over them since the dawn, and walking as sun-walkers beneath the same eye of the Earth Mother their ancestors had followed out of the wastes. A scattered, hunted people had become a nation, and it had done so without ceasing, for a single day, to be what it had always been. Yet a home does not end a people's trials. It only changes them, and the fiercest test of the Tauren's harmony would come not from any outside enemy, but from within their own tents. The plains around Mulgore were never fully at peace. The Quill-Boar contested them still, a thorned and burrowing people who, by their own belief, sprang from the blood of Agamagan, the great boar demigod who fell in the ancient war against the demons, and whose body, where it lay, gave rise to the vast brambles that still choke parts of the land. The Quill-Boar were counted among the Tauren's oldest foes, and it would be easy to name them simple villains of the story. But the record, read closely, resists that. When the Quill-Boar rose to raid horde caravans in the years after the cataclysm broke the world, the archdruid Hamel Runatotem investigated and found the cause was not malice, but thirst. Their own water had failed them, and they were desperate. The Tauren answer to that discovery is worth remembering. Rather than annihilate the raiders, they turned water loose from the earth itself and told the Quill-Boar the new spring was a gift, and to trouble them no longer. Even against an ancient enemy, the instinct was to restore balance rather than to crush. The Tauren did not have to imagine what the opposite of their way looked like, for they watched it arrive on their own borders. When the goblins of the Venture Company spread into the lands west of the plains, into the forests of the Stone Talon Mountains, they brought with them the finest engines their cunning could devise, and they turned those engines on the living world without a moment's hesitation. Whole stretches of ancient forest fell in a matter of months. The records describe the charred vale and the crags around it, stripped to soot and bare rock, the streams fouled with oil and refuse, the land reduced to the same dusty desolation that centuries of war had once made of Desolace far to the south. To the goblins, this was simply commerce, resources lifted from the earth and turned to profit. To the Tauren, it was desecration in its purest form. The body of the Earth Mother opened for coin. And here the record captures something almost unbearably telling about their temperament. Many of the Tauren, faced with this ruin, still held to the hope that the Venture Company might be reasoned with, that even the despoilers could somehow be brought to understand. It was, the chronicles admit plainly, an unrealistic hope, but it reveals the shape of their souls. Even against those who were unmaking the world for coin, the first Tauren instinct was not to destroy them, but to persuade them. That instinct had by then found its highest expression in a change quietly reshaping Tauren society. For most of their history, the Tauren had honored the Earth Mother without walking the Druid's path. But after the Third War, Hamel Runetotem, a childhood friend of Cairne, and one of the wisest of his people, sought out the Night Elf Archdruid Malfurion Stormrage and asked to be taught. Malfurion agreed, over the bitter objections of others who believed the druidic arts belonged to the Night Elves alone, and Hamel became, by the reckoning of the chronicles, the first Tauren druid in nearly 20 generations. Through him, the Tauren entered the Cenarian Circle, and the meaning of that entry is easy to underestimate. A people who had always believed the land was their mother now learned to tend it with their own hands, to heal and to grow, and to walk in the shape of its beasts. From what the records suggest, this was less a conversion than a homecoming, the Tauren finding, in the Druids' discipline, a formal language for the reverence they had carried since they first rose from the soil. And in that same spirit, others among them would later take up the light not as a borrowed foreign faith, but as devotion to Anshe, the sun that had always been one of the Earth Mother's two eyes, becoming the Sunwalkers who prayed to their own oldest god by a new name. Here, then, was a people who had at last become whole, rooted, united, tending their land and their neighbors, drawing strength from the balance they had always kept. And it was in exactly this moment of wholeness that the Tauren came nearest to losing their soul, not to any enemy of the plains, but to one of their own. Not every Tauren believed that gentleness was strength. The grim totem tribe, and above all its elder crone, Magatha, had long regarded the Tauren way of balance and patience as a weakness dressed up as virtue. Magatha believed she, and not Cairne, should lead all the Tauren, and when she found she could not take that power through counsel, she resolved to take it through treachery. Here was the Tauren's own inner shadow made flesh, one who looked at a people that refused to conquer and saw only prey waiting to be ruled by someone willing to be cruel. The opening she needed came from the wider horde. Cairne had grown deeply troubled by the recklessness of Garrosh Hellscream, the young and aggressive war chief who had risen to power, and when Cairne came to believe the horde's honor was being stained under Garrosh's reckless rule, he did the most honorable thing his traditions offered. He challenged Garrosh to the Mak'gora, the ritual duel, meaning to settle the fate of the horde by his own hand. What the old chieftain did not know was that Magatha had offered to bless Garrosh's great axe, Gore Howl, before the fight, and had instead coated it with a potent poison unknown to Garrosh and to Cairne alike. The chronicles are painfully clear that Cairne was winning. He had the measure of the younger warrior. Every witness agreed the duel was his. Then the axe grazed his chest, and the poison went to work, and the strength drained out of the mightiest of the Tauren until he could no longer lift the shattered remains of his ancient rune spear to defend himself. Garrosh, bewildered by a collapse he did not understand, struck the final blow, and in his last moment the old bull grasped the whole shape of the betrayal, that he, who had lived his entire life by honor, would die by treachery, killed not by his enemy's strength, but by his own kin's poison. Cairne's body was not yet cold before Magatha ordered the grim totem to fall upon Thunder Bluff and the towns around it, killing all who stood in their way, meaning to seize the Tauren nation in the vacuum his death had opened. In a single night, the harmony of Mulgore, the thing the Tauren had carried unbroken through 100 lifetimes of wandering and war, was nearly extinguished by a Tauren hand. That it was not extinguished is the last and truest turn of the story, and it is where the answer to our question finally shows itself plain. Cairne Bloodhoof, Cairne's son, escaped the slaughter. He was not yet even aware that his father was dead when a defector warned him his own life was forfeit. But Cairne did not flee into exile, and he did not answer massacre with massacre. He gathered what allies he could, among them Javan Grim Totem, one of the crone's own tribe who refused her treachery, and Gazlo, the goblin who led the port of Ratchet, and he took back Thunder Bluff. And when the city was his, and Magatha stood defeated before him, Cairne made the choice that defines his people more sharply than any battle ever could. He did not execute her. Living by the example his father had set even in death, he exiled Magatha and those who had followed her, and let them go. That mercy is the whole thesis of Tauren history, compressed into a single decision. Cairne had every right of vengeance, every practical reason to end the threat forever, and the full power to do it. He chose restraint instead, not because he was too soft to kill, for he had just fought a war to reclaim his home, but because he understood that a Tauren who ruled through slaughter would have handed Magatha her victory even in her defeat. He would have become the thing she believed the Tauren secretly were. By sparing her, he proved her wrong about his entire race. Cairne's remains were laid upon a pyre with the shattered fragments of his rune spear, and Cairne took up the mantle of High Chieftain, and with it the promise his father had made that the debt owed to the orcs for their aid would be honored. In the wars that followed, when the horde itself lurched toward cruelty and tyranny, it was very often the Tauren, and Cairne above all, who stood as its conscience, insisting on honor when honor was inconvenient and refusing to let his people be dragged into atrocity. The gentle folk of the plains became, in the end, the moral spine of a nation far larger and far fiercer than themselves. The record preserves the cost of that conscience with unusual clarity. When Sylvanas Windrunner rose to lead the horde and bent it toward cruelty, she raised the corpse of a long-dead Cool Tyran, Derek Proudmoore, meaning to twist the reanimated man into a weapon and turn him against his own grieving family. Cairne looked at that scheme and saw in it everything his father had died refusing to become. And so, quietly, at enormous risk, he freed the man and returned him to his sister across the water, choosing the honor of an enemy's peace over the loyalty his war chief demanded. When Sylvanas discovered the betrayal, Bane did not deny it. He admitted it to her face and asked how many times his people were expected to forsake their honor before nothing was left of them worth defending. For that, he was seized and imprisoned, condemned as a traitor to the very horde his father had sworn the Tauren to serve. He was freed only when horde and alliance alike, sickened by what their leaders had become, rose together against the tyrant, and his stand became one of the sparks that ended her reign. It is a strange thing to say of the gentlest people in the world, but it is true. When the horde forgot its honor, it was a Tauren who paid to remind it. And so we return to where we began, and to the question I have carried down all those roads. Can a civilization remain strong without conquering nature? The Tauren answer is not a philosopher's answer. It is written in their survival. They were never the strongest people of Azeroth by the measure the world usually keeps, not the most numerous, not the most feared, never the masters of any land they held. By that measure, they should have vanished a dozen times over, scattered by the Centaur, ground down by the wandering, poisoned from within. They did not vanish. They endured, and they endured precisely because they refused to buy strength at the price of becoming conquerors, because they kept, through every reason to abandon it, the conviction that the land was their mother, and that a people who broke the world to rule it would no longer be worth saving. That, I think, is the deepest reversal the record offers. We began by imagining that the Tauren's harmony was a kind of weakness made bearable by a kind world. It was the opposite. Their harmony was the strength, a strength measured not in dominion, but in continuity, in the refusal to be remade by cruelty, in the simple, stubborn act of remaining themselves across ages that demanded they become something worse. Conquest is loud, and it fills the histories, and it almost always ends in ruin. The Tauren offer a quieter proof that a people can outlast the conquerors by never joining them. There is a further irony the histories rarely name. The conquerors of Azeroth, built to be remembered, raised their citadels and their empires precisely so that their power might outlast their bodies. And the greatest of those works stand today as ruins, hollow and nameless, the very places I have spent my life crawling through in search of who once lived there. The Tauren built almost nothing meant to endure. They carried their history in song and totem rather than stone, and they are still here to sing it. Their monument was never a structure. It was the unbroken thread of their memory, passed hand to hand across every disaster, and that thread proved harder to sever than any wall of granite. Perhaps that is the lesson buried deepest in their story, that what is carried gently can outlast what is built to dominate. In the years after Cairne fell, the chronicles preserve a small and gentle moment, when malevolent spirits rose against Mulgore, and Bane stood to banish them. The shades of his father and mother appeared before him, and Cairne reminded his son that the way of the Tauren was harmony and not destruction, that both light and shadow are needed to see what lies ahead. It is a fitting last word for a people who were nearly destroyed 100 times and answered each time not by learning to destroy, but by learning to endure. The fire on those mesas still burns, the grass still bends in the wind, and the children of the earth are still there to feel it, which, against everything that tried to take it from them, is a kind of victory no conqueror ever won.